Hello, history class. I miss you all. We're going to get started today on chapter 16. In our textbooks, we're going to take notes today. So you should have in front of you this Reconstruction packet of notes. And we're going to work off those. You guys are familiar with this. I'm going to go over the notes, and there's all these blanks, and you're just going to fill in as we go along. Won't be able to write them on the board, of course, but we've done this during remote learning, so should be nice, easy, simple. So like I said, this chapter is about Reconstruction, trying to build back the nation as a whole. And of course, the 4-year-long Civil War just happened, the bloodiest battle that America would take place in up to this point. And unfortunately, most of the battles took place in the South. So the South has been ravaged. We know that General William Tecumseh Sherman, he and his men marched to Atlanta to take a railroad station, and from there he marched to the sea after he took the city of Atlanta, and he basically burned factories, railroad stations, even homes, farms, whatever he needed to try to keep the South from having the supplies that they needed and getting the supplies out to places. So a lot of damage was done there. General Phil Sheridan was a little further north, but yet still in the South in Virginia, and he burned the Shenandoah Valley. So the South saw a lot of destruction. We also have the slaves, who were now free people, and they're sort of displaced. Where do they go? Where do they get jobs? How do they get educated? And even a lot of whites, they were also displaced. They needed jobs and things like that. So that was something else that would need to be dealt with in building back the nation. And of course, unfortunately, there's going to still be animosity among Northerners and Southerners because of this great war that just happened, and brother fighting brother, and et cetera, et cetera. So still lots of hard feelings there. But Lincoln had been thinking about how to handle this even in the midst of the Civil War. Like, how are we going to build back the nation? How are we going to bring the South back into the Union? At his inaugural address in March of 1865, this is something that he said at the end: "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace." So this is his desire, to see the Union healed, the nation healed. So back even in December of 1863, Lincoln introduces a plan known as Lincoln's 10% plan. So this is going to kick off the notes here. Lincoln wanted to make it easy. That's your first blank. He wanted to make it easy for Southern states to rejoin the Union. So if we look at our first bullet point, one of the things that he wanted was, as 10% of a state's voters swore an oath. So 10%, your next blank for the first bullet point. As 10% of states swore an oath of loyalty, your next blank, loyalty to the U.S., then they could organize a new state government. So state government's that last blank in the bullet point. So the idea is 10% of the state's voters had to swear an oath of loyalty to the U.S. Then they could start building back their state government. That was Lincoln's idea. Of course, this is the second bullet point. The new government must declare an end to slavery. That must be part of their new constitution, their new government. No slavery. Next, that was the bullet, that fill in the blank there for the second bullet point. Third bullet point, the state could send members to Congress is the next blank, to participate in national government. So that was one of the steps. And then fourth bullet point, amnesty, which I have defined here as group pardon. So amnesty is your blank. Amnesty would be included for all former Confederates who would take the oath. In other words, if you fought for the Confederacy as a soldier, you would be pardoned from basically your treasonous act toward the Union. So that he was granting amnesty. The only exceptions to this amnesty pardon were that if you were a leader, that's the next blank, in the government of the Confederacy, and any of the top military officers. So officers would be that next blank. You did not receive the same amnesty as those who just fought for the Confederacy. I'm going to spell amnesty too for you. A-M-N-E-S-T-Y. So amnesty, leaders, and officers are those blanks. Now, also, Lincoln has his plan, but Congress has their plan too. They come up with what is called the Wade-Davis bill. Okay, 6 months after Lincoln's plan, they devise their own plan and they basically pass it in Congress. Now, Congress had a stricter plan for Reconstruction. That's your first blank under there. Congress's stricter plan for Reconstruction. Their plan included, first bullet point, 50%, first blank, 50% of states' voters would sign a loyalty oath before the state could return to the Union. That's your next blank. So as opposed to Lincoln's 10%, it's 50% of the state's voters had to sign this loyalty to the nation before they could return to the Union. Second bullet point, anyone who voluntarily, that's the next blank, voluntarily fought for the Confederacy was barred from voting for delegates creating the new state constitution. Second blank on the second bullet point. So in other words, Lincoln wanted to give them amnesty if you fought for the Confederacy and you weren't an officer. But Congress said if you voluntarily, not drafted, but voluntarily fought for the Confederacy, that you were barred from voting for new delegates to create a new state constitution. Because again, they're trying to build back the government down there. And so the states had to basically reform their government. They didn't want any influences from the old Confederacy and the thoughts and things that they had. So they're trying to be very strict about it. Last line there, Lincoln wouldn't sign. So we know the president has to sign off on bills. Lincoln is the blank. He wouldn't sign it. So it actually never became a law, which is the next blank. But you can see that Congress's idea right now and Lincoln's ideas differed. And here's how. Here's our two starred points here. Lincoln wanted a lenient approach to Reconstruction and building back the nation. Lenient is L-E-N-I-E-N-T. And he wanted to see, along with a lot of his fellow Republicans, a strong Republican Party rise up in the South. And so he hoped to win the support of influential Southerners. So influential is I-N-F-L-U-E-N-T-I-A-L. He thought that's the way that they would be able to do it, as if they could have a softer approach and get some of these Southerners to be part of the Republican Party and those that were influential. Next star is radical Republicans. So radical goes in that blank. So they're still Republicans, but they are a more radical sect in the Republican Party. They wanted to see a strict policy. So strict is the next blank. They wanted to keep people who led the South into secession out of power. I'm going to spell secession for you. That's your third blank. S-E-C-E-S-S-I-O-N. So in other words, if you were a radical Republican, you wanted a strict policy and you did not want anybody who led the South into secession to take over any type of political position or power. Okay, so next section, March 1865, I had opened up with saying that they needed to find a way to educate formerly enslaved people. They needed to find a way to get them jobs and see that they were fed and things like that, because obviously they're displaced now. So in March of 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau was created by Congress. Freedmen, capital F-R-E-E-D-M-E-N''S, Bureau, capital B-U-R-E-A-U. It was created by Congress. The idea was to help these freedmen. That's your first bullet point, freedmen. Freedmen are enslaved people that were freed by the war. Its job was going to be the next bullet point, to provide emergency relief to those displaced by war. So some of the ways they were going to do that. Third bullet point, set up schools to teach them to read and write. A lot of white Northern women and a lot of freed African-American women were the people that taught in these schools. As a matter of fact, one free African-American woman who taught in there, her name was Edmonia Highgate. She was the daughter of freed slaves. She taught at a Freedmen's Bureau school in Louisiana. She realized that the majority of her pupils came from plantations 3, 4, even 8 miles away. So she knew that they were anxious to learn, and they were willing to walk those distances so early in the morning. So you could see their fervor for wanting to have an education and better themselves and get jobs and so on and so forth. Fourth bullet point, there were also schools that were set up to further education. Some of these schools that are worth mentioning: Fisk University in Tennessee, Hampton University in Virginia. Booker T. Washington is one of the people that attended Hampton University in Virginia. He was very eager to do so and get an education, better himself. He was already able to read at this point, but again, furthering their education was important. Next bullet point, it helped freedmen find jobs. And last bullet point there were a lot of disputes that would have been happening between these freed blacks and whites in the South especially. So it set up a court system, that's your blank, court system to deal with white and black disputes. And then, of course, worth mentioning is our next underlined topic, the 13th Amendment. Now, we know that Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. This only freed the slaves in areas and territories that weren't controlled by the Union at the time. So they needed an amendment to actually abolish slavery in the United States of America. That is the 13th Amendment. It abolished slavery, that's your blank, throughout the nation. North, south, every state, every territory. Slavery would be abolished. January 1865, Congress approved this. And it was officially ratified 1 year later, but approved is your next blank. Second bullet point, it banned slavery and forced labor. So slavery is your first blank, labor is your second blank on that bullet point. And it gave Congress, next bullet point, the power to make laws that enforced it. So in other words, Congress had the power it needed to come against anybody who might try to still, institute slavery, things like that, forced labor. And then finally, the last section on here is Lincoln's assassination. Unfortunately and sadly, April 14th, 1865, this is just 5 days, that's your first blank, 5 days after Lee surrendered. So the Civil War is literally just over. Lincoln was shot while attending a play at Ford's Theater. That's capital F-O-R-D''S, Ford's Theater in Washington. He and his wife went to see a play there. And next bullet point, John Wilkes Booth. John is John. Wilkes, W-I-L-K-E-S. Booth, capital B-O-O-T-H. He was actually an actor who had performed at this play or at this theater before, and he unfortunately was a Confederate sympathizer, and he shot Lincoln in the back of the head, H-E-A-D. Lincoln would have been in one of those booths where, people of authority or position would sit, so high up. He snuck into the booth and he shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Booth himself, he kind of was on the lam, but he was shot dead 2 weeks later. That's your next bullet point, or that's your next blank on the third bullet point. People had been pursuing him, of course, and he was trapped in a barn, next bullet point, that was eventually set on fire. Booth was not in this alone. He was kind of like the ringleader, if you will, but fourth bullet point, 8 other people were convicted. 8 is the blank there. 4 of them were hanged for the plot, because Lincoln wasn't the only person that was being targeted. Other people that were prominent people in the Union's pursuit in the Civil War, they actually were some of the people, like Ulysses S. Grant, for example, who were going to be targeted too. Some people just foiled on their part, and it didn't work. And then the last bullet point, Lincoln's successor then would be his vice president, Andrew Johnson, which is he was a Tennessee Democrat, so he was a Southerner, but he wanted nothing to do with secession, completely against it. He sided with the Union, so that's why he was vice president under Lincoln. And again, Andrew Johnson is your last blank. So that's everything for the notes today, and we will continue on this chapter a little later. All right.